Okay, so where we left off in the previous section, we were downloading an iOS image from router 1 from one of the other routers. And the key with this is that once the image download is complete, it's always going to run its own checksum because it knows, like internally, there's a signature in the iOS image it knows to check. So in this case, we know that the file is fine. If on router 1 we now look at the dir output, it should show the new file in Flash, which it does, which is the 12.4.25 bin. If we look at the show version, though, you'll see that in RAM right now, it's still running the original version that was booted. So it doesn't actually change until we save the config and then reload. So it's going to make sure that if there was some problem in the transfer where the file failed, it's still going to run its active instance of iOS until you actually start over. Now, the problem where you can, or the case where you can run into a problem with this, is that if the checksum is bad, some of these platforms can only store one file in Flash. So now the old image is gone, and if the new one is there but it's corrupt, then if you reload, it's going to go to the what's known as the ROM monitor mode, which is basically like crash recovery. So anytime you change the image, you want to make sure that you get the checksum is verified okay. Then at this point, we can save the config. We can say either copy run start, copy running config to start a config, or I could just say WR to write the config. Then once this is done, then we can reload. So you'll see with some of these older platforms like the 2600s, a lot of times it will take a good amount of time to save the config or to write the config or run some of the show commands, just because compared to some of the newer platforms like the 2800s or 2900s, they just have a lot slower CPUs. So again, they should be able to run most of the same features. It's only in cases where we get into really advanced things like voice over IP or things like Call Manager Express that some of the older platforms won't run that. But for all the routing and switching features, anything that's basically covered in CCNA, CCNP, or in the case of CCI routing and switching, even up to that point, it's like 95% of the topics you can still do on some of these older platforms. Now for the switches, on switch 1, when we look at the dir here, this one is running an IP base image of 12.2.44 SE6. You'll see that some of these platforms can run multiple feature sets for the switches. And again, based on the file name, you can't really tell exactly what this means. So if you were to go to the feature navigator and plug the file name in, it's going to show you exactly what features that it's going to run. But what I want to see here is that some of them should be running the advanced IP services, which actually none of these have on them. Now, in the case of CCNA, I don't believe that we're really going to run into any problems running this base image. If you see that any of your switches are running some of the older ones, like this one is 12.1, and you see that any of them are running the newer versions here, the 12.2.44, I definitely do want to change this one before we go on to the rest of the LAN switching topics. So the procedure here from the switches is going to be fairly similar, where either I could configure the switch to be the TFTP server itself, or I could send this to the Windows machine, and then from the Windows machine download this back to all of the other ones. So just to keep a copy of it, I'm going to copy this to the TFTP server. So I'll copy from Flash. This is the file name. Then copy this to the TFTP server, which is 192.168.0.100. And assuming that the Windows machine is actually running the process, we should see that it's automatically going to start receiving the file. So here now I have these stored just on the desktop. If you were then to look at the actual files here on the desktop, if you look at the actual file size, ideally this would be the exact same size as what's on the router. So in this case, you can't really see it too well. The font is kind of low or kind of small there. But it says the file size is 29.957.284. So this should be what the routers then see when they look at the flash. If we look at the DIR flash, $29,957,284. So it's the exact size of what the source was. Again, normally you would want to run like an MD5 or an SHA hash against this to make sure that nothing has changed. But it's a pretty safe assumption that if the file size is equal, then nothing has really changed in the transit path between them, or from the source to the destination. Now, the other usage of this, the TFTP server, is not only going to be for the software images, so the iOS of the routers and the switches, but it's also going to be used for archiving their configurations off. So just like I previously said, to copy the flash to the TFTP server, you can say to copy either your running config to the TFTP server, or you could copy your startup config, where the running config is the changes that I've made since the last time that I booted. The startup config is going to be the last time that I saved, or if I haven't saved since the last time I reloaded, it's going to be what it was before last reload. So if I were to say copy my running config to TFTP://192.168.0.100, and I'll say, you can see by default it saves it with the hostname -confg. We now have this file r4-config. When you open this as an ASCII file like in Notepad, you'll see that you can't really read what the config is. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Because it's not a regular like DOS file. So it's a specific encoding just for the TFTP transfer. So this is a little bit different than if I were just to say show run and then paste that into a text file and then save it. So typically you would keep some sort of archive on your TFTP server of all the device configurations. So then if someone makes a change or the router crashes and you need to reload it onto something else, you have the option to do that.
What's the threshold inversion number for the switch iOS that you want to upgrade to? I'm running 12.1 right now, so do you want to go up?
Do any of them have 12.2 on it?
They're all running 12.
What I'm going to do then is, and it may not even make a difference when we get to the LAN switching, but what I'll do is make a folder on the Windows desktop that has the correct versions in, and then those are going to be the ones that we'll change to if we run into any problems. But you'll see the vast majority of differences between them are kind of going to be outside of our scope. And you can see exactly what these are. If I were to go to the first switch and take this image version and then go to the feature navigator again, which is cisco.com/go/fn for feature navigator, then compare images. And this takes a little bit of while because the database is pretty large of how many versions they have. But you choose, is it, in this case it's regular iOS, the ones that run on the switches. The major release would be 12.2. Then the platform, you would pick Catalyst 3550. Do it on the other side and then pick the two different image names or the two different version names, and then it'll show you what's exactly the difference between them feature-wise. But I'm going to add that in there, the new ones, to make sure that we don't run into to any problems with it. Now, this type of basic management of the routers, if you go to Cisco's main website and under support, click on support, then go down to configure. I want to show where this stuff is located in the documentation. And there's a couple different pages on the documentation that are going to be relevant to us. As I mentioned before, there's a difference between the configuration guides and the command reference, where the configuration guide basically says, if I want to configure network address translation, this is the step-by-step list of what you need to do. But if I want to know what does this exact command for network address translation do, then I would check that under the command reference. But the problem is with the documentation, it's not really obvious as to how you get to this in the first place. So from this page that shows the select your product or technology, under products, click on iOS, then regular Cisco iOS, and the versions that we are running are 12.4. So 12.4, 12.4 mainline, then the configuration guides. So I'm going to open this one in a tab, and then why did that do that? Then under the reference guides, so actually let me start this over in a new window. So it's under support, then at the bottom configure, products, iOS, regular iOS, 12.4, 12.4 mainline. Then we would want the configuration guides, and under reference guides, the command reference. Now, the way that these documents are broken down is that first they're separated by major topic domain. Some of the stuff you'll see doesn't really apply that much to most network designs anymore, like dial access. This would be for analog modem dial or like for ISDN dial. ATM a lot of the times is considered a legacy technology as well. Same as like the IBM bridging, this would be for SNA support. But the stuff that is relevant mainly is going to be under IP and then also under IP routing. So as we get to the different configurations, like how do you set up OSPF, how do you set up RIP, how do you set up EdgeRP, it's going to specifically list in a bullet list or in step 1, step 2, step 3, these are the individual commands you need to enter in order to get RIP working or to get EdgeRP working. Now for the basic management things that we went through so far, like changing the iOS image, backing up the configuration, this is going to be under configuration fundamentals. And if you're first learning iOS, this would not be a bad place to start for some of the documentation. One of them is configuring the operating characteristics of the terminal. As I mentioned before, this talks about some of the different key characters, the definition of the escape character and other key sequences. This would talk about like what are the different control keys for just doing basic editing inside of iOS. Then under managing the file system, this would be things about what's the difference between storing your configs on like a USB flash drive versus the integrated file systems. Basic file transfer services, this would be like the TFTP server would be documented under here. Managing configuration files. Some of these are definitely useful when you have a network design that doesn't have a full-blown management application that's dealing with the network. Like in the case of some of these applications would be like HP OpenView or SolarWinds or Cisco Works, where they're applications that run on like Windows or they run on Linux, but their job is to keep copies of the device configurations, then through protocols like SNMP to ask the routers, is your temperature of your CPU okay? Is the amount of memory that you have free large enough for whatever we're running? But in the cases that you don't have full network management suites deployed, the iOS itself supports a lot of these basic functionalities. Like one of them would be the configuration replace and rollback, or the configuration change notification and logging. So maybe you're making a change on a router that is in production. It's currently forwarding traffic. And if you screw up the config and you lock yourself out, then you're going to have problems with that. So what this feature can do is say that once I make a change, it's going to wait a certain amount of time, and if I don't tell it that that change is fine, it's going to delete the changes that I made and roll back to its well-known working configuration. Or this one here, the configuration change notification and logging. This is going to keep a local log on the router to see what are all the commands that your users are entering. So if you want to track which administrators are making which changes, you can do this locally on the router as opposed to deploying a full management system like TACAX or Radius accounting. Same would be true about like loading and maintaining the system images. So the one that I mentioned before there, the MD5 file validation. This is just generic stuff that's how do you talk to the routers through the console, how do you talk to the switches through the console. It's not really related to LAN switching or to IP routing. It's just basic management techniques of how the iOS works. So really before you can get into some of the later configurations we're going to do, if you don't understand how the basic functionality of the console works, or like the exec process, how we enter commands, how we run show commands and stuff like that, you want to make sure you understand those basics first before we go on to some of the more advanced topics. But again, this is under configuration fundamentals, under that 12.4, in which case this is the version we're using, 12.4 system management. For the other variation, which is the command reference, you'll see that the topic domains are the same, like we have ATM, dial, IP, but when you go to a particular section, it's going to show you the individual commands, what are the arguments, so what are the options that you can change onto that command, and then what do those individual options mean, and also what are their default values. So let's say, like in this case, we were doing the TFTP server command. This would be under either network management or I want to say it's under network management here. Then you could see they're simply listed in alphabetical order, where our command was the TFTP server command. So it's not under this one. Let's see. Let's actually go back a couple steps. This is the interface and hardware components. Sometimes these don't map one-to-one. So it's not under this one. Sometimes in the command reference, it's hard to figure out exactly where the individual command that you're looking for is. So if we take a couple steps back, let's go back to the main documentation page. So after we click 12.4, it gets us to this page where we would choose either the configuration guides or the command reference. There's a section under release and general information that is the master index of commands. So it's basically every command that is documented in every single topic. So here, if you just follow it in alphabetical order, then this one should be under the very last section. And since there's tons and tons of commands, most of the time you probably want to search through this. Like in your browser function, do Control F for find, then TFTP-server. You click on this, then it's going to bring you to that particular document. So here, this was under iOS Configuration Fundamentals command reference. But you'll see when you look at the individual commands, it shows you what the syntax is, which a lot of the times you can figure this out by using the context-sensitive help. But also what it does is under the usage guidelines, it tells you what is that command and why would you want to use it in the first place. So if you ever see a command and you don't really know why it's there, the easiest way to figure out what it does is to cross-reference this in the command reference then look at the usage guidelines, and it tells you why you want to do it, and then a lot of times it'll give you examples of what the syntax looks like. Okay, any questions up to this point on the basic management topics that we went through so far? So erasing the config, reloading to a blank config, changing the iOS image, and then backing up the config as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is get everybody a copy of the diagrams that we need to be using. So there'll be this one here, which is the Ethernet, the serial diagram. Then if you want to go through those basic procedures that I did up to this point, just erasing the routers to their defaults, and then making sure that everything is running the correct image name or the image number. Tomorrow we're going to focus on LAN switching. So we'll spend the morning talking about just some general theory of how Ethernet switches work, how VLANs, how spanning tree works. Then the vast majority of the time we're going to look at examples on the command line. But you want to make sure before we get to that point that at least you can get access to all of the devices, consoles, and that you know that all of them are working and that they have the correct iOS versions.